If you like what you're listening to, support this podcast on Patreon. Patreon.com, search Phil Dawson, or find a link in the show notes and join up. It's very much appreciated. Thank you for listening. Chapter 26, Clockworks. Tawnos almost made it to the border before the Makfawa caught up with him. He had almost expected it. He had been extremely lucky so far, and he knew that luck would run out sometime. After his escape, he had cut north and east across the desert, making for the passes of Argiv instead of following the route of ruined towers back to Yosha. That had shaken the immediate pursuers. He spent some time among the Cerinthian refugees on the shores of the Marden, but traveled mostly alone and at night. He rode by the soft light of the mist moon when he could, and by the erratic sputtering of the glimmer moon if its larger sibling was not in the sky. Neither moon had been aloft for the previous evening, and, close to his goal, Tawnos decided to risk traveling by day. He had almost lost his horse and his life to one of Mishra's inventions earlier in the day. The creation was some sort of reactive device similar to Urza's Sentinels. In this case, the device lay beneath the sands, waiting for a trespasser. As Tawnos rode through the device's domain, the sand around him began to chum, like water coming to a boil. Tawnos tried to rein in the beast, but the horse bolted, taking the scholar with it. He was lucky again. Had he stayed, Tawnos would have been trapped. Metallic coils and saw-toothed arms erupted from the sands, flailing blindly in all directions. A rasping shriek rent from the sky and the ground, shattering creature. Afar off in the distance behind Tawnos came an answering scream. Tawnos clung to the horse's mane, looking behind him as they fled. The coils and arms twitched briefly, then slowly pulled themselves back into their sandy pit, covering themselves as they retracted. In another moment, the ground was as it had been before. Tawnos felt a cold trickle of sweat run down his back. If the device had merely attacked, he would have been able to avoid it or outrun it. But it had signaled that it had been tripped, and something further back had answered the scream. Tawnos dug his heels into the horse's flanks and rode hard for the passes, hoping not to meet any other hidden traps en route. He looked back once to see a cloud of dust on the horizon. Pursuit. Tawnos pushed the horse harder, but when he looked back again, there was already a dark dot at the base of the cloud, ripping up the desert as it passed. A dragon engine. The land was rising now, and small. Stringy shrubs dotted the rock outcroppings. Tawnos thought about hiding, but instead he chose to make for the pass. Most of the dragon engines were large, clumsy beasts, and it would have trouble negotiating the rocks easily. He looked back a third time and could make out the details of the dragon engine's form. It was one of the recent ones, and though it was a smoother, sleeker creation than the earlier Mishra-manufactured models, it still did not compare to the monstrosities that had leveled Krug. Even at a great distance, Tawnos could see the beast's head lurch back and forth like that of a spastic insect. Tawnos smiled, but the smile died as great wings sprouted from the creature's back. They unfurled in the afternoon sun and began to beat as the engine charged forward. The cloud of dust disappeared as the mechanical creation sailed aloft. Tawnos cursed and jabbed the flanks of his mount hard, spurring it to a full gallop. He would not make it, he thought. Flying dragon engines had destroyed most of his air support at Tamakul. There was nothing in the Argivian arsenal that could stand up to them. For a moment, Tawnos considered abandoning his horse and hiding, but instead he pressed on. If he could reach the narrow passage at the beginning of the pass, he might be able to find an Argivian outpost before the dragon found him. He almost made it. Tawnos did not see it, but he could feel the pressure of the air as the beast dived above him. There was a roaring, and heat scorched his back. The horse screamed and stumbled, jolting him from his saddle. Tawnos dived forward, arms swung before his face to protect himself. He managed to twist and to land on a shoulder, but the force of the blow rolled him to one side of the rocky outcropping. The chief scholar gagged on the smoke rising from his burning horse. It was still alive and thrashed in agony as its flesh burned away. Tawnos felt pity for the horse. But the objective part of his mind also noted that the dragon engine had breathed some sort of flaming jelly, a substance that was not extinguished even as the horse convulsed in the dirt. Something new to worry about, he thought. Tawnos looked up and saw that the dragon engine was above him, pulling up for another swooping dive. There was a little cover that the flaming liquid could not breach, and the scholar had no doubt that the engine had sensed his movements and was coming back to finish the job. That was when the metal-winged birds appeared. They were like a cloud of insects that rose from the east and swarmed the great engine. At first, Tanos thought they were real birds that had somehow been driven into battle. Now he saw they were small constructs, each no larger than a man. They swooped and dived around the larger engine like sparrows harrowing a hawk. The dragon engine craned its neck back and struck against one of the smaller winged machines. The avian nimbly darted away, warned of the assault by the change in air pressure caused by the dragon's movements. Though racked with pain, Tanos smiled. He knew what the bird artifacts were and who had built them, and from what the builder had gotten the original idea. The bird machines dived and darted around the dragon engine. The engine managed to remain aloft, but the avians were faster than its snapping jaws. It breathed its ignited fluid, but that only brought down a single opponent. The remainder flocked around it, and, beating its wings frantically, the dragon engine lost altitude. The bird machines had razor-sharp beaks and tore the outer housing of the dragon engine away. There were several holes already in the Makfawa's back, bored in the concentrated attacks from the smaller machines. Tanos watched as the small bird machine flew into one such tear in the engine's fuselage. Near the joint where the dragon engine's wing strut met the body, there was a skittering, crunching noise, and then a small explosion. The wing folded in on itself, trying to retract back into the body. The dragon shrieked in almost living pain and pitched to the left. It plummeted to the ground, its one good wing still trying to scoop the air beneath it. Tanos crouched as the dragon engine struck the ground 200 yards west of him. Even at this distance, he could feel the heat of the explosion as its liquefied tanks and fire ruptured and the entire creature went up in an incandescent ball of flame. Tanos shielded his eyes from the flame, and when he could look again, nothing remained but a burned-out shell of metal ribs. If the engine had been operated by crewmen, they were dead. The metal birds swooped and regathered in a flock, a chaotic combining and recombining of individuals in different flight patterns. Then they organized themselves into a V-shaped formation and winged eastward toward the pass. Tanos limped along behind them, making for Argivian territories. "Clockwork avians," said Urza, setting down his favorite chalice. "And, yes, they were based on your toy for young Harbin." "I had assumed as much," replied Tanos, settling down in one of the overstuffed chairs that now dominated Urza's reception hall. His wounded arm was in a sling, but the master scholar was otherwise unharmed. Urza lowered himself into the opposite chair. The Lord High Artificer's hair was pure white now, and the lines around his face were deeper. Tanos was sure Urza had lost weight since he last saw him, and he knew the older man now used spectacles with which to read. Despite himself, Tanos reached up and ran his fingers through his own hair. It was starting to thin in the back. "After you were captured," said Urza, "I sat down with Harbin, went over all your old toys. He knew in what order you had built them and kept them in good working condition. There were some bits of brilliance among them, you know." "Mostly ideas and fancies that did not seem to have immediate use," said Tanos. "Indeed," said Urza with a wry smile. "Well, the avians had an immediate use. Those flying dragon engines were bad enough, and when they started breathing this liquid fire," he held up his hands, "we were hard-pressed by your absence. We thought you dead." "I wasn't," said Tanos. "Not quite." He flexed his right hand. "I'm glad you weren't," said Urza, and Tanos saw the older man meant it. He could imagine Urza at the drawing table, turning over and over in his hands one of Harbin's toys that his son had outgrown, shoving aside the memories of their work together in order to unlock the design secrets of Tanos' creations. The moment passed, and Urza cleared his throat. "The avians were a godsend. They were simple, cheap to produce, and easy to target against Mishra's larger machines. One of the enemies of this war is distance, but the time any weapon moves from the front to somewhere it can actually do damage, a counterweapon has been created and deployed. The Clockwork avians have given us a chance against the flying dragon engines, but by the time we had regrouped to make another assault, Mishra had a new guardian on his borders. The Groundbreakers," said Tanos. "I met one the same day I was attacked by the dragon engine." "Nasty," agreed Urza. "They slow the army down, which gives my brother still more time to prepare for a counterattack." "What was the liquid fire?" asked Tanos. "The substance the dragon engines breathed." "Another new development," said Urza. "Apparently out of Sarenth. They're deposits of oil and thicker, more viscous fluids that bubble out of the ground there. My brother has found a way to break down that liquid into its component parts, and one of those parts is highly flammable, like goblin powder. It almost destroyed the army before we got the avians in the air." He paused for a moment. "We still hold Yosha." And the passes in Argiv and Corliss, said Tanos. But we haven't been able to press forward since then, concluded Urza. We're still waiting for him to make his move, to attack somewhere so we can react. Neither side seems to have the power to make a major push, nor the time to adequately secure the borders. And in the meantime, we're draining our resources at a faster rate. I noted more foundries on the way back to the capital, said Tanos. More foundries, factories, and mines, returned Urza. We have felled most of the forests from Corliss and are buying metal from the Sardian dwarves. The merchants are starting to complain about the amount of gold heading north, and they're agitating for a campaign against the dwarves themselves. They want us to fold the dwarven territories into ours and their resources with them. In your opinion? Asked Tanos, thinking he should have asked, in your decision, instead. I don't want to attack without good reason, said the older man, but I'd prefer to keep the dwarves at an arm's length. You can't trust anyone just because they claim to distrust the Falaji Empire and want to be your friends. The Gixons did that. Tanos nodded. One of the first results of his return had been rounding up and imprisonment of the priests of Gix. The fact that they were advisors in Mishra's court made many people in Argiv very nervous, and others very embarrassed. The priests of Gix had wheeled the wary into the school while you were gone. Did you know that? Said Urza. And right under Ricklow's nose, too. He was redder than the setting sun when it all came out. Nice to know there was some good from all of this, said Tanos. A silence fell between the two men. Urza frowned slightly and ground his palms together. I have been working on your clay statues as well, he said at last. I have an idea about using that primal clay material without the framework. It could be more malleable that way. Tanos looked at his mentor. Urza, what's troubling you? He knew the older man well enough to recognize when Urza was talking around a subject. The Lord Protector raised a hand to argue, then shook his head and was silent for a time. Harbin, he said at last. He wants to be an ornithopter pilot. Tanos nodded slightly. We've talked. He rode out to meet me. Like a flash of lightning, as soon as word reached Pendragon of your return, said Urza. When we first heard about the Battle of Tamakul and feared you dead, he wanted to run out and join an army unit to avenge you, you know. I know, said Tanos somberly. His mother was shattered when she thought of you dead, said Urza, shaking his head and looked off into the middle distance. When I came back from a campaign, Harbin never rode out to meet me. Tanos shrugged. I know he respects you. Respects? Yes, Urza said irritably. He's always so polite and respectful. His mother has taught him well there, but we don't really talk. He knew all about the toys you made for him, but he has no interest in artifice beyond how it can be used. He's bright, but that basic sense of curiosity is missing, and he thinks the world of you. He respects you, repeated Tanos. He just grew up around me. Yes, Urza let his voice trail off as if his thoughts took him somewhere else. Then he said, So he told you he wants to fly an ornithopter? About the second set of words out of his mouth, said Tanos, after he made sure I was still alive. And you think? Urza raised his brows. Tanos sighed. He's 14. That's a good age to start. He's quick. He's bright. As you said yourself, he'd make a good pilot. His mother will have me slain if I do it, said Urza. She doesn't want her son exposed to the war. She wants him safe and secure. He should go into government, she says. She's already arranged a marriage for him when he's of age, you know. He's told me, said Tanos. She mentioned it in one of her correspondences, said Urza, nodding at a pile of unanswered mail. Nice family. I'll give you a nobility. He ground his palms together. But the problem is, everyone is needed for war. Everyone! My own factories are operating under skeleton staffs as more men and women are needed for duty. I've tried using goblin slaves in the workshop, but they create as many problems as they solve. How could I demand everyone suffer for this accursed war, then protect the boy? But if I don't, his mother will be heartbroken. I don't really want to do that either. Tanos looked at the older man. Urza could reason out the smallest detail of a device, but real life always confounded him. I think you should let the boy take the training, said Tanos at last, phrasing his thoughts carefully. Well, he's made his case to you, said Urza. And made it well, said the former apprentice. He's smart and has good reactions. If he's expected to eventually lead, he'd best start now. But his mother, began Urza, will have to accept it, finished Tanos. I'll speak with her and remind her that I came back in one piece. Urza shook his head. If he's lost in battle. I didn't say you should send him into battle, said Tanos. Urza raised an eyebrow, and Tanos continued. Just let him train to become a pilot, then make sure that his assignments are in more peaceful parts of the kingdom. Don't send him to Yosha if an assault is brewing, but have him run messages to Corliss, scouting missions, aerial surveys. There's more than enough jobs for an ornithopter pilot that do not involve direct contact with the enemy. Urza looked at his hands. He won't like it. Then he'll complain about it, said Tawnos. And if he comes to you, you can point out how bad it would look if the Lord High Artificer and Protector of the Realm used privilege to put his own son in a combat unit over other deserving young men. Urza rubbed his chin. He'd hate that. Yes, he would, said Tawnos. You see, I have no desire to see Harbin endangered, but I think shielding him from everything won't help him either. Urza chuckled and hoisted his heavy chalice. It is good to have you back, Tawnos. I have been lessened in your absence. And I in yours, Urza, said Tawnos, raising his own goblet. But as he spoke, he heard swift footfalls coming down the hallway outside. Both men turned toward the door as the messenger arrived, grasping the door frame to bring herself to a halt. Chief Scholar, said the messenger. Lord High Artificer, she gulped for air. A message has come from the spies. Mishra's army is on the move. Both men looked at each other. Then Urza said, Where? Yosha? The passes? The messenger shook her head and inhaled deeply. Teresia City. He's headed west. For Teresia City.